Mexico is at war.
Son papás que no mandan a sus hijos a la escuela por miedo. Negocios que no abren por miedo. Restaurantes que abren, pero no va nadie por miedo.
The smuggling routes through Mexico are controlled by a number of cartels, of which the Sinaloa Cartel and Jalisco New Generation Cartel are perhaps the best known. Since 2007, there has been a spike in violence, with homicide rates today standing at near-record highs. While over that same period, drug overdoses in the United States have become much more common. But the trend that most people are overlooking is the rise of China.
Mexican cartels and Chinese organized crime continue to use the United States as their middleman.
They have become an indispensable link in the supply chain of illegal drugs that crosses into the United States. And in this video, I'll explain why. This is the geopolitics of the Mexican drug trade, with hindsight.
Sinaloa Cartel, let me introduce you to Chinese organized crime. By working together, they've been able to get millions, if not billions of dollars. It's like nothing we've seen before.
The image you may have that illegal drugs are cultivated in the jungles of Latin America and then shipped to the United States is outdated. So this of course is still happening, but there now also exists an emerging market. Since 2010, the number of synthetic drug seizures increased more than sixfold. This isn't produced by farmers in the Colombian jungle, but in laboratories, by chemists and industrial suppliers. So criminal organizations in China and Mexico have done something very unique, and we are just finding out about this. Let me explain the geopolitics. In the early 20th century, the United States began criminalizing drugs. At that time, cocaine was sold over the counter at pharmacies and marijuana was casually grown in the southern US and Mexico. But a series of laws were passed, outlawing these drugs, and this created instantly a black market. The United States pressured Mexico to align with their policies, and in the 1920s and 30s they followed suit, fearing US retaliation if they wouldn't. But Mexico was a different place. They had just come out of a civil war. They were politically fragmented and had weak institutions. The country is huge and much of its terrain is rugged and mountainous. The law was often enforced by local strongmen, who often didn't care much for Mexico City's decisions to criminalize drugs, especially now that they could be sold for so much higher prices. But see this. The number of homicides was seeing a clear downward trend, while these trafficking families in Mexico were expanding their control of the drug trade. But that was reversed in the 1980s.
We intend to do what is necessary to end the drug menace and cripple organized crime.
Reagan's war on drugs disrupted the system. The drug trade in Mexico was controlled by local smuggling networks, who paid off law enforcement and in return received protection from the government. Violence was discouraged because it would attract attention. But the US in the 1980s suddenly pointed a big spotlight on their operations.
San Francisco Bay may not look like a war zone, but this is the western front of the Reagan administration's war on drugs.
Most of the illegal drugs in that time were produced in South America and were shipped through Colombia and the Caribbean. This was the main route the US was targeting. But in response to these US efforts, drug smuggling routes simply shifted to Central America and Mexico. Almost overnight, Mexico became the country with the second largest profits of cocaine, with $3.5 billion in 2009. And these smuggling networks now have had decades to professionalize and embed their operation in politics and law enforcement. When a couple of years later the US shifted its focus on Mexico, they were now facing well-armed, well-financed operations. They were putting up a fight, resulting in much more violence on the streets of Mexico. The cartels now had an immensely successful business and they were willing to go to war to protect its interests. But there was a problem.
In Mexico, power is never surrendered easily. Time is catching up with the PRI.
In 2000, the political party who had ruled Mexico for 71 years lost the elections for the first time in history. The cartels didn't like this. They didn't want change. They had a good thing going for them. In 2006, the government decided to go all in and deployed the army at scale, but it backfired horribly. When the government decided to increase its enforcement, homicide rates rose. And today they are more than double than what they were in the early 2000s. The problem was that these cartels were now much better organized, equipped and financed, and the government's crackdown only fractured cartels. Wherever they scored some wins, it increased competition in this region for control over these routes, and this led to even more violence. It did nothing to address the root cause of the problem, which first and foremost is the demand in the United States. Over the past 2 decades, anywhere between 93 to 99% of illegal drugs that are smuggled by land into the United States cross the US-Mexico border. And here's the good news. The trade in some drugs, like marijuana, have almost entirely been eradicated as legalization policies took effect. But over the same period, we've seen a dramatic rise of some synthetic drugs like methamphetamine.
Yet another large drug bust, this time involving hundreds of pounds of meth.
Seizing more than 1,000 pounds of methamphetamine.
This is a completely different drug. It doesn't require a certain climate or environment, which led to South American countries in the tropics to emerge as major manufacturing hubs. Instead, it requires 2 main things: industrial logistics and chemicals.
China's first quarter growth exceeded expectations.
Chinese companies are now flooding the market with cheaper products.
China in the early 2000s was aggressively expanding their chemical manufacturing sectors. Entire cities were built around massive plants that were producing chemicals to export to countries around the world. These were concentrated in just a couple of places where raw materials, knowledge, and industrial plants were often clustered together. The Chinese were manufacturing geniuses. They managed to increase their market share from 11% in 2000 to nearly 50% of global production in 2024. But an unexpected side effect of this growth was that they now suddenly held the key to producing the synthetic drugs that were becoming increasingly popular around the world. The only thing that was still missing was demand.
Alarming new numbers from the CDC about heroin use in America. It is stretching into new communities. Heroin-related deaths have increased 4-fold from 2002 to 2013.
In the United States, a sequence of events created a sudden spike of demand for opioids. First, in the 1990s and 2000s, doctors were widely overprescribing prescription opioids like OxyContin and Vicodin, leading to millions of patients to develop a dependence. In the early 2010s, authorities sharply restricted access to these pills, and as prescriptions were drying up, many users that were dependent on these drugs turned to illegal opioids, which in the beginning was mostly heroin.
So because it's more complicated to get those sort of narcotics, then people are moving to cheaper heroin.
The nature of addiction is it takes more and more to get the same effect. In that world, something stronger is always better, regardless of the outcome.
Mexico at that time had 2 main areas where opium was cultivated and heroin was produced. This was smuggled across the border into the United States, where drug dealers soon learned about a shortcut. They ordered chemicals by mail from China, which they then used to produce fentanyl. The heroin was cut and spiked with this drug to make it more potent and to increase their revenue. This was possible because China poorly enforced the export of these chemicals, but after years of pressure from the United States, they announced stricter controls in 2019. And that's where Mexican cartels saw an opportunity. They were doing business in a country where the government was much more corrupt and they had decades of smuggling experience. Over the past decades, Chinese imports into Mexico had increased more than 5-fold. The challenge with the chemicals that are used to make fentanyl is that many have legitimate industrial and medical uses. They get easily lost amidst the billions of dollars of goods that's imported into Mexico each year. And we see that shift on this chart. In 2019, China announced restrictions of precursor chemicals, and that's when production moved to Mexico and more fentanyl was smuggled across the border into the United States. 2 years later, fentanyl had become the leading cause of death amongst young people, above COVID and motor vehicle accidents. The trend that we're seeing is that whenever policies successfully target the operation of a criminal network in one place, it shifts to somewhere else. And in Mexico, the cartels have become deeply embedded in all branches of society. When the government then tries to confront a cartel, it leads to violence. And if they are successful and they break up their operation, it leads to competition between other cartels to control this territory. And that leads to even more violence. While in the meantime, nothing is done to address the root cause of the issue, which is the demand for illegal drugs in the United States. So there are actually some very interesting reasons for why these drugs are illegal in the first place. But I want to first get a little bit deeper into the role of China. They are a supplier state. They have the chemicals, and the Mexican cartels are exploiting policy gaps to get their hands on them. But Chinese criminal groups are directly involved in another surprising way.
Federal agents say that they seized more than 1,300 barrels of chemicals headed to the Sinaloa cartel.
That is enough to make nearly $500 million worth of meth.
That's what's happening in China's undeclared war against the United States, working with Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel, a foreign terrorist organization that are killing Americans on a daily basis.
So imagine that you live in China and you have a lot of money and you want to diversify your assets. You may want to buy a building abroad or invest your money somewhere overseas. Or perhaps you just want to hold your assets in dollars. Well, that can be a problem. China has very strict laws that limit the amount of money that you can take out of the country, but some criminal networks in China have found a solution: underground banking. This is how it works. These shadow banks act as a broker. As a wealthy Chinese individual, you pay the broker in the Chinese currency and then they buy whatever you want to have in dollars. But the problem that the broker has is that it needs a lot of cash in dollars. So where do they get this? It so happens to be that Mexican cartels have the opposite problem. They make a lot of money in the United States, and for them it's very risky to move this cash across the border into Mexico. So the cartels and these Chinese underground banking networks are believed to have made a deal. The cartels are paying the Chinese in cash, and in turn they help them launder their money so that they can use it in Mexico. Many of these Chinese shadow banks are working within the United States. Between 2020 and 2024, the US flagged $312 billion as suspicious activity associated with such Chinese money laundering networks. And that's only the part that we know about.
Fentanyl is taking the opioid epidemic to a new level of urgency.
There may be gross underreporting of opioid-related deaths, meaning the opioid crisis may be far worse than initially thought.
We can be the generation that ends the opioid epidemic. We can do it.
The trade in illegal drugs is unstoppable.
Do it.
You may be successful in stopping an operation somewhere, but as long as there is demand in the United States, there will be a criminal organization somewhere else that can help with the supply. This is the reality that we live in, because we decided to criminalize these drugs. And be honest, if you look at this, you would want to do everything in your power to make sure that the stuff that has this effect on people is eradicated from the face of the earth.
Y'all boys is tripping. Wake up, wake up, wake up.
But the truth is that drugs were almost never criminalized out of concern for public health. In the early 1900s, marijuana became illegal during a period of large-scale Mexican migration to the United States. The drug was associated with crime, disorder, and foreign influence. Marijuana wasn't criminalized over medical concerns, but because it was seen as a social threat. In the 1950s, factories were closing and there was a growing anxiety about crime and social breakdown. Heroin, in this context, became the symbol for moral decay. The US government cracked down on this drug not because they wanted to treat addiction, but because they wanted to show that they could reassert order and enforce social norms. Similarly, in the 1960s and 70s, while anti-war protests were sweeping across the country, and during a time of civil rights activism, the government criminalized drugs like LSD as a way to suppress dissent. This was later acknowledged by government officials. It was never really about health. Across different eras, whenever a society felt unstable, one of the responses was to criminalize a drug that was associated with the wrong people. But the end result today is that we have largely drawn arbitrary moral boundaries that decide the types of intoxication that we consider civilized and those that we consider to be deviant. And this corrupt moral judgment now directly shapes the violence along these trade routes. In Mexico, perhaps more than anywhere else in the world. So I really hope that you enjoyed that video. If you want to help me scale this channel and produce more videos like these, consider becoming a channel member. Your contributions would help me cover some of the costs for doing research and for producing these videos, and you can cancel at any time that you want. If you want to find out more about this, you can click on the link in the pinned comment or in the description, and then after that, here are 2 more videos for you to consider for your next watch.